For just a few days, it appeared that one of the world's most dangerous confrontations might finally be cooling down. Then, without warning, explosions were reported again. The United States announced a new wave of military strikes against Iran, saying the operation was a direct response to attacks on commercial ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran condemned the strikes as aggression, while world leaders urgently called for. The question is no longer whether tensions exist. The question is whether this latest confrontation marks another temporary crisis, or the beginning of a much larger strategic confrontation with consequences reaching far beyond the Middle East. Because what happens in one narrow waterway could influence global energy prices, military alliances, and international diplomacy for months to come. To understand why these strikes matter, we first need to understand why the Strait of Hormuz has been one of the world's most strategically important locations for decades. Stretching between Iran and Oman, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the busiest maritime choke points on Earth. A significant share of globally traded crude oil and liquefied natural gas passes through these waters every day, making uninterrupted shipping essential not only for Gulf countries but also for energy consumers across Asia, Europe, and North America. Any disruption immediately attracts worldwide attention, because energy markets react quickly to uncertainty. For years, the United States has maintained a strong naval presence in the Gulf, arguing that freedom of navigation is a core international security interest. Iran, meanwhile, has consistently emphasized its security interests along its coastline, and has periodically warned that foreign military activity near its borders increases regional instability. This long-standing rivalry has produced repeated episodes of tension, including sanctions, naval incidents, cyber operations, proxy conflicts, and disputes over Iran's nuclear program. The current crisis did not emerge in isolation. It follows months of escalating military exchanges and diplomatic setbacks that steadily increased the risk of direct confrontation. Earlier in 2026, the conflict widened dramatically as U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran were followed by Iranian retaliation, leaving regional diplomacy under intense strain. Although efforts were later made to reduce tensions through temporary understandings, those arrangements remained fragile from the beginning. The immediate trigger for the latest escalation came after several commercial vessels were struck while transiting the Strait of Hormuz. According to U.S. Central Command, those attacks represented a violation of the existing ceasefire framework and justified a military response intended to protect international shipping. The U.S. military stated that its strikes targeted air defense systems, command and control infrastructure, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and numerous small boats operated by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran rejected the U.S. justification and described the strikes as an unlawful act of aggression. Iranian officials warned that the country's armed forces were prepared to respond if necessary, while simultaneously signaling that diplomatic discussions could continue under certain conditions. As the military exchange unfolded, another battle was taking place far from the battlefield. Financial markets immediately began assessing the possibility of prolonged instability. Shipping companies reviewed routes through the Gulf, insurance costs increased, and analysts closely monitored oil prices for signs of further disruption. Even before any broader conflict emerged, uncertainty itself became an economic factor. Meanwhile, governments across Europe, the Gulf and Asia intensified diplomatic contacts, recognizing that any sustained disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could affect global trade far beyond the Middle East. And that raises the next critical question. What exactly has been confirmed about the latest U.S. operation, and what remains uncertain? Before examining the broader strategic picture, it's important to separate what has been confirmed from what remains uncertain. According to the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, American forces launched a new series of strikes on July 7th in response to attacks on 3 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Washington described the operation as a defensive response intended to protect freedom of navigation and international shipping. CENTCOM later stated that the operation struck more than 80 military targets, including Iranian air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar installations, anti-ship missile sites, and more than 60 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) small boats operating near the Strait of Hormuz. These details come from official U.S. military statements and represent the U.S. government's account of the operation. At the same time, Iranian state media reported explosions in southern Iran, including around the port region of Sirik. Iranian officials condemned the strikes, calling them a violation of Iranian sovereignty while rejecting Washington's justification for the attacks. Reuters also noted that independent verification of every reported strike location was not immediately possible. Another confirmed development came from the U.S. Treasury, which revoked a license that had temporarily allowed certain Iranian oil sales, signaling that Washington was combining military pressure with renewed economic sanctions. Oil prices reacted immediately as markets assessed the risk of prolonged disruption in the Gulf. Meanwhile, the United Nations International Maritime Organization (IMO) issued a document urging countries not to recognize any unilateral attempt to control or restrict international navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The organization emphasized the importance of preserving freedom of navigation in one of the world's busiest maritime corridors. Despite the escalation, U.S. officials also stated that technical diplomatic talks with Iran were continuing and that no additional American strikes had been carried out in the following hours, suggesting that military action and diplomacy were proceeding simultaneously rather than replacing one another. The Economic Times. Now that we've established the confirmed facts, the next question is far more important. Why does this incident matter far beyond the Middle East? The answer lies in geography, economics, and deterrence. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply another shipping lane. It is one of the world's most critical maritime choke points, linking Gulf oil producers to global markets. Even limited military activity in the area can increase shipping insurance costs, alter tanker routes, and create volatility in global energy prices. Markets often react not only to actual disruptions, but also to the possibility that commercial traffic could become more dangerous. From Washington's perspective, allowing repeated attacks on commercial shipping without a response could weaken the credibility of its long-standing commitment to protecting freedom of navigation. Successive U.S. administrations have viewed secure sea lanes as a strategic interest because they underpin global trade and energy flows. From Tehran's perspective, however, the continued presence of American military forces close to Iran's coastline has long been portrayed as a security concern. Iranian leaders have repeatedly argued that foreign military deployments increase regional instability, although many countries reject Iran's interpretation of international navigation rights. This creates a classic deterrence dilemma. Each side believes its actions are defensive. Each side interprets the other's actions as increasingly threatening. History shows that such situations carry a heightened risk of miscalculation, particularly when military forces operate in close proximity under intense political pressure. Another important element is diplomacy. Although military strikes dominate headlines, negotiations have not completely collapsed. U.S. officials continue to describe ongoing technical contacts with Iranian representatives, indicating that both governments may still see value in preventing a broader regional war. The Economic Times. That combination, military confrontation alongside diplomatic engagement, is not unusual in international crises. It allows governments to project strength while keeping open a path toward de-escalation. However, as long as commercial shipping remains vulnerable and mutual distrust remains high, every new incident carries the potential to trigger another cycle of retaliation. And that brings us to the next chapter. Beyond the military headlines, this confrontation is already producing consequences for the global economy, energy markets, and international security. Those effects may ultimately prove just as significant as the strikes themselves. While fighter jets and missiles dominate the headlines, financial markets often react within minutes. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important maritime choke points. Around 1/5 of global oil consumption passes through this narrow waterway, making any disruption a concern not only for the Middle East, but also for consumers and businesses worldwide. Following the latest escalation, oil traders immediately priced in the possibility of supply disruptions. Although prices did not surge uncontrollably, they became noticeably more volatile as investors weighed two competing possibilities: a prolonged military confrontation or a return to diplomacy. The shipping industry reacted just as quickly. Several shipping companies reassessed voyages through the Gulf, while marine insurers increased risk premiums for vessels operating in the region. According to Reuters, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz slowed dramatically as security concerns intensified, with some ships delaying departures or adjusting routes where possible. Those higher transportation costs rarely remain confined to shipping companies. When freight becomes more expensive, the additional costs can eventually affect fuel prices, manufacturing expenses, airline operations, and consumer goods. Even countries far from the Middle East can experience the economic effects of instability in the Gulf, because global energy markets are deeply interconnected. Another important factor is investor confidence. Periods of geopolitical uncertainty often encourage investors to move money into assets considered relatively safe, while riskier investments experience greater volatility. Markets are influenced not only by military events themselves, but also by uncertainty about what might happen next. For governments, this creates an additional challenge. Military crises are no longer measured only by battlefield outcomes. They also affect inflation, public finances, trade, and economic growth. Beyond the economic impact, military planners around the world are closely studying this confrontation. According to U.S. Central Command, The recent operation targeted air defense systems, command and control facilities, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and numerous IRGC fast attack boats. From the U.S. perspective, these strikes were intended to reduce Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, however, rejected the American justification and described the operation as an unlawful act of aggression. Iranian military officials warned that any further attacks could provoke additional retaliation. For military analysts, one of the most significant lessons is the growing importance of maritime security. Modern conflicts are increasingly shaped by the protection of sea lanes, commercial shipping, satellites, cyber networks, and logistics. Controlling access to critical infrastructure can sometimes produce strategic effects without either side seeking a full-scale conventional war. Another consequence involves deterrence. The United States is attempting to demonstrate that attacks on international shipping will carry military costs. At the same time, Iran seeks to show that it can continue to influence security in the Gulf despite sanctions and military pressure. This creates a difficult strategic balance. If either side responds too weakly, it risks appearing vulnerable. If either side responds too aggressively, the possibility of broader conflict increases. That balance explains why governments often combine military operations with diplomatic communication at the same time. Military readiness has also increased across the region. Naval forces continue monitoring commercial shipping, intelligence collection has intensified, and regional partners remain on heightened alert while watching for any indication that the confrontation could spread beyond the Strait of Hormuz. As expected, the latest escalation prompted rapid diplomatic reactions. The United States defended its actions as necessary to protect international commerce and freedom of navigation, arguing that attacks on civilian shipping cannot be ignored. Iran strongly condemned the strikes, insisting that Washington had violated its sovereignty while maintaining that it would continue defending its national interests. Iranian officials also indicated that diplomatic contacts had not completely ended, leaving open the possibility of further negotiations. The international community largely focused on preventing a wider regional conflict. Several governments urged both sides to exercise restraint and avoid actions that could further threaten global trade and energy supplies. Diplomatic efforts involving regional mediators, including Oman, continued alongside military developments. Meanwhile, international attention remained fixed on the Strait of Hormuz itself. The waterway has become more than just a shipping route. It now represents a test of whether diplomacy can keep pace with rapidly escalating military events. And that brings us to the final chapter of this documentary. What happens next? Could the crisis gradually calm through negotiations? Or could another single incident trigger a much broader confrontation? As this documentary has shown, the latest escalation is about far more than a single military operation. It is part of a broader struggle involving regional security, global energy markets, and international diplomacy. What happens next depends on decisions that have not yet been made. Several scenarios remain possible. The most stable outcome would be a return to sustained negotiations. Despite the recent fighting, U.S. and Iranian officials have continued indirect diplomatic contacts through regional mediators, particularly Oman and Qatar. Both sides have publicly indicated that diplomacy remains possible under certain conditions. If those talks continue, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz could gradually stabilize, reducing pressure on energy markets and lowering the risk of another military confrontation. Another possibility is a continuation of limited strikes without either side seeking a full-scale war. History shows that the United States and Iran have often tried to avoid direct, prolonged conflict while still responding to actions they view as unacceptable. Under this scenario, occasional military exchanges could continue alongside diplomatic negotiations, creating an unstable but controlled situation. The most dangerous scenario would involve additional countries becoming directly involved. A prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could threaten global energy supplies, affect international shipping, and increase pressure on governments throughout the Middle East. At the time of writing, however, there is no verified evidence that such a wider regional war is inevitable. That distinction is important. Strategic risk does not mean strategic certainty. Looking back at the events we've examined, several conclusions stand out. First, the recent U.S. strikes and the attacks affecting commercial shipping have once again demonstrated how quickly tensions in the Persian Gulf can affect the entire world. Second, the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Even limited disruptions can influence oil prices, global trade, shipping costs, and financial markets far beyond the Middle East. Third, although military action has dominated recent headlines, diplomacy has not disappeared. Indirect talks continue through regional mediators, showing that both confrontation and negotiation are unfolding at the same time. Finally, many key questions remain unanswered. Will diplomacy succeed? Will deterrence prevent another confrontation? Or will another unexpected incident reshape the security landscape once again? Only time and future decisions made in Washington, Tehran, and regional capitals will determine the answer. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more fact-based analysis of military strategy, geopolitics, and international security, consider subscribing for future documentaries. Thank you for watching.